One of Europe's most well-known cities is Paris, France. Paris is often called the city of love, but it wasn't always such a romantic getaway destination. What is Paris best known for?
Paris is the capital of France. It's pretty much always been the capital of France.
Okay, they have, the Seine and like the things that you can walk by, the quays.
Eiffel Tower, the Arch, don't know what that one's called. Notre Dame and the Louvre Museum.
I guess, Haussmann and like the boulevards and the way it's planned around a lot of central squares.
I guess there's good shopping in Paris. Yeah, hats, French, shopping. Paris is full of style, city of love.
Just outside Paris is a big palace built by Louis XIV.
Good wine and cheese. Yeah, not that I know. Oh, Joe Millionaire.
Paris, the capital of France, sits in the heart of Europe. With its monuments, art galleries, and museums, it is one of the world's most popular tourist destinations. But look again, Paris isn't all it seems. The city can't grow outwards because of geography. It's hemmed in by hills and the river Seine. The city can't grow upwards because of geology. Much of the bedrock beneath the streets is too fragile to support the weight of skyscrapers. The story of Paris is one of engineering and science preserving a city where no city should be. Sometime in the 3rd century BC, the Parisi, a tribe of Celtic Gauls, built a defensive fortification on a natural barrier, an island on the river Seine. Their fortified village held off all invaders until 58 BC, when it fell to the Romans. The Romans called their new settlement Lutetia, meaning marshland. They transformed it into a typical Roman city, with bridges linking the island to both sides of the Seine. They expanded the village onto the river's left bank, which is known as the Latin Quarter today. Florence Zaragoza specializes in Roman history.
The Romans were the first town planners of Paris because they knew how to exploit the natural layout of the land perfectly.
The new settlement grew up the slopes of the left bank, away from the river and the constant threat of flooding. Soon, Roman Paris boasted all the features of their expansive empire, some, like these baths, remarkably well preserved to this day.
At the time, these walls were all covered with marble as ornate decoration for the baths. They were always very grand rooms. In the Roman Empire, public baths were important social places. People came, of course, to wash, but they also came to meet each other, to discuss things, or just pass the time.
Although the settlement was a regional outpost and not yet the capital, 6,000 people lived here. The Romans built roads, houses, and an arena, and provided spectacular entertainment. But Roman Paris didn't last. In AD 481, the town was invaded by the Franks, a Central European tribe and the ancestors of the modern French. 600 years later, Paris had grown. With additional bridges and roads, it had become an important trading center, and that made it more vulnerable to attack. The Vikings and even the English posed a threat. Just before the 13th century, King Philippe Auguste, a visionary engineer, devised a simple solution to Paris's defense needs: a wall. Today, in backyards and alleys throughout Paris, traces of Philippe Auguste's landmark engineering project are still visible. The wall, with its 67 towers, was an ambitious project. It ran all around the city, enclosing 675 acres.
There, you can see very well. Look, it's been repaired a bit. You can see some bricks on top of it. That really is one of the old towers from the year 1200, one of Philippe Auguste's towers.
Historian Renaud Gagneux is on the hunt for remaining sections of King Philippe's wall. It's a search that has brought Gagneux to unlikely places, like the garden of this convent.
There it is. Mind the flower pot. These are some really fine remains that have a special feature. Look here at the slope of the hill. I think it must have been built very quickly, but it's still a wall of cut stone, even though it's uneven. It's just down here on the right.
In most of Paris, the wall is hidden or it has been destroyed, but in one part, it is still possible to see its true scale.
You can see this part of the wall really well. It's one of the sections where it's best preserved.
Laboriously built by hand with blocks of limestone, the wall is an impressive structure. It stands 32 feet high and 8 feet thick. Every 50 yards stands an imposing watchtower. With his city secured by an impressive wall, Philippe Auguste proceeded to build himself the ultimate fortress. Today, all that remains of his fortress is a small section preserved underneath the famous Louvre Museum. But it was once the biggest building in Paris, the final defense in Philippe Auguste's massive wall encircling the city. The centerpiece of his fortress was a tower, 150 feet in circumference and 100 feet high. When Philippe Auguste died in 1223, Paris covered more than 600 acres. Drawn by the protection of the wall, people flocked to the city. By the end of the 13th century, Paris was the biggest city in Western Europe, but the 300,000 people who lived safely inside its wall soon faced an enemy within: drought. The river Seine was the city's only source of water, even though it was polluted. And unlike today, it usually dried up in the summer. Paris began to run short of clean drinking water. Tucked away behind these suburban apartments stands this unusual bell-shaped tower. It's a gateway to an extraordinary feat of medieval engineering. A network of aqueducts 20 feet below ground. Medieval monks built the aqueducts. Half a mile of their original system remains intact today. The monks had identified a source of spring water, and they cleverly trapped it, filtered it, and sent it along these underground tunnels to the center of Paris.
We're underneath one of the water inlets in part of the aqueduct. There's a spring here, but it's above the level of the roof of the aqueduct, so it comes out here and falls directly into the aqueduct. The water is collected and it drops following the slope to the end of this bit, where it runs down the hill.
The aqueduct is powered by nature's oldest force, gravity. At its peak, hundreds of thousands of gallons of water flowed down these aqueducts every day and into the fountains of central Paris. The surrounding streets still trace the sloping course of the medieval aqueduct. They even named the local cafe after it. It's called the Drains. Without the tireless efforts of the monks, drought could have destroyed Paris. But the water from these aqueducts wasn't enough to provide for a growing city. Water shortages continued in Paris for hundreds of years to come. In 1815, the authorities decided something radical had to be done. They asked engineer Louis-Dominique Girard to solve Paris's water problem once and for all. What Girard came up with was inspirational and ingenious. It helps keep the Seine flowing to this day. There was a plentiful source of water in the countryside to the east, but it went nowhere near Paris. The question for Girard was how to connect it to the city, 60 miles away. His answer was an engineering triumph, a canal linking this rural river to the Seine. The canal would supply clean water and be navigable for barges taking food and timber into the city. But this dual role only added to the problems. With Paris constantly demanding more water, Girard had to make sure his canal was always full. Added to that, each barge passing through would displace millions of gallons that would be wasted. The canal would need constant replenishing. Girard's solution was to build pumping stations that would bring in water from a river nearby. But there was another problem. The canal was higher than the river, which meant the water had to be pumped uphill. Girard wasn't a hydraulics engineer, but he designed and built a machine that still runs today, untouched by modern technology. The flow of the river turns two giant wheels that operate huge pumps that force river water into this large chamber. From here it is pumped over 300 yards to the Ourcq Canal, up a 35-foot-long slope. It's a colossal achievement. The canal runs 60 miles through countryside and into the eastern suburbs of Paris, bringing much-needed water to the capital. It was directed to fountains in the city center, and the ornate decorations made it easier to fill up buckets. Without the canal and a network of locks, the River Seine, the vital artery running through the heart of Paris, would almost run dry. In the Middle Ages, a lack of water was one of many problems facing Paris. Gloom hung over the city. France was locked in a 100-year war with England. This was the age of the legendary French heroine, Joan of Arc. It wasn't until 1453 that the English were driven out. Under a new king, Paris became the capital of France. People flooded in, searching for work and hoping for wealth. By 1589, the narrow streets in Paris were cramped and overcrowded. As the city became gridlocked, it was obvious that Paris needed another river crossing. The king, Henry IV, took control and ordered new construction. It's called the Pont Neuf, which means new bridge. It's the first bridge made of stone to cross the River Seine. Now it's the oldest bridge in Paris, but in its day, it was an engineering marvel. Today, Paris boasts 36 road, rail, and footbridges that span the Seine. That's one bridge every 300 yards. Traveling down the Seine is like taking a journey through the history of bridge building. The Pont Neuf consists of no less than 12 arches and is 300 yards long. It joins both banks of the river with the island in the middle, the old heart of Paris, called the Ile de la Cité. Because the stone is so heavy, builders had to sink extra deep foundations directly into the riverbed. It was a monumental task, made possible by Paris's ongoing problems with water.
At the time of Henry IV, in summer, there was practically no water in the Seine, so the foundations were built during the summer.
Bridge building on a dry riverbed was much easier, but progress was still slow. The bridge builders could work only during the warm summer months. As this was the first stone bridge in Paris, they were pioneering their own construction method.
They erected timber scaffolding onto which they laid the cut stones one at a time, slightly wedge-shaped stones so that they formed an arch. Each arch was built one at a time.
The limestone from which the Pont Neuf is made didn't come from quarries outside of Paris, but from the bedrock beneath the city itself. In their hunt for stone, Parisians dug out the very heart of the city, leaving a maze of tunnels below. This is just one of them. The quarries are some 50 feet below ground. They reveal much about the area's geology.
It's coarse limestone in several high strips. We're in a site that is 46 million years old here. Each time you see a solid layer of limestone, it's a marine deposit from when Paris was underneath the sea. You can see these deposits very clearly here. So the sea receded and left a layer of rock.
Marine in origin, limestone is hard-wearing and water-resistant. The bridge builders had a ready-made supply of the ideal stone. But retrieving it was back-breaking, dangerous work in the hot, cramped quarries below Paris.
It was very dangerous. A lot of people were injured. A lot of people died.
How did the stones make it to the surface? Philippe Thévenon paints an extraordinary picture of 16th century quarrying techniques.
They cut along the fault line in the rock. They made a deep cut of about 10 to 15 feet deep. They often did it lying down. And then the rock was cut into on each side. And if the block didn't then fall under its own weight, they used steel wedges to lever into the cracks. Once the block had fallen, it was pushed on rollers to the base of the shaft, where the person at the top would raise the stones up with a man-powered winch.
One by one, every stone for the Pont Neuf was mined and extracted in this way. The bridge took nearly 30 years to complete. The bridge linked all of Paris and made it faster to move across the city. Over 400 years later, the Pont Neuf is still open to traffic. It stands as proof of Renaissance engineering skill. By 1785, the population of Paris had reached 600,000. People lived in slums, and their poverty bred discontent and revolution. Houses were packed, sanitation was almost non-existent, and disease was commonplace. Life expectancy was just 40 years. The dead were buried in a few large cemeteries in the heart of the city, but these were now filled beyond capacity. Once more, Paris was on the brink of a public health crisis. The smell was unbearable. The order went out to remove all bodies. No more burials were permitted in central Paris. What they didn't know was that every rain shower washed through the bodies in the cemeteries, carrying dangerous bacteria through the soil and into the water table. Every bucket of well water was a bucket of poison. Every night for 2 years, gravediggers exhumed the bodies from the cemetery of Saint-Innocent, the first of many to be emptied. The bones were brought here to catacombs, or underground burial chambers, well outside the city's boundaries. The catacombs were created from disused quarries that had provided limestone to build the bridges and churches of Paris. They extend for miles underground.
This place was officially consecrated so it could take all the bodies from all the Paris cemeteries that were emptied from 1786 onwards. The bones were transferred at night. Carts were filled with bones. These carts were then covered with a black cloth. In front of the cart, a priest sung the burial service. It was all done at night so as not to upset the people too much.
As each body was removed, its identity was noted where possible, and the total number going to the catacombs was recorded.
So this is how the bones were laid out. The principle is the same as a dry stone wall. You form a heap, a stack of long bones. Behind them you throw in all the broken bones, the small ones. You make a dry stone wall, and you put a mass of bones behind it. The difference is that these walls of bones were elaborately decorated with skulls.
Eventually, all the cemeteries in central Paris were emptied. As the bodies of 6 million people were laid to rest, another revolt broke out, this time among the living. In 1789, the French Revolution swept through the streets of Paris. Crowds stormed the famous prison, called the Bastille, and set the inmates free. The king, his family, and other aristocrats were hunted down, imprisoned, and executed. This took place during the period known as the Reign of Terror. In place of the king, France installed a republic, and in 1804 the military leader Napoleon Bonaparte crowned himself emperor. Napoleon made Paris the capital of his expanding empire. He built the Arc de Triomphe, or Triumphal Arch, in honor of his military conquests. But it was Bonaparte's nephew, Napoleon III, who had the greatest impact on modern Paris. By 1850, the population of Paris had reached 1 million. The city was struggling to cope with too many people in too small a space. Emperor Napoleon III drafted a radical new plan to rebuild Paris. It included widening streets, improving traffic flow, and clearing the slums that fostered unrest and violence.
You had many winding streets, you had decaying houses, overcrowded houses, slums, also where the streets were not clean. It was really a city of the old times.
Napoleon hired city planner Eugene Haussmann. His assignment was to modernize the city and make sure that such a revolution would never happen again. Paris was a network of narrow streets, some with open sewers and no running water. At night, these streets were deserted and dark. People were too terrified to venture out. These narrow streets were home to hundreds of thousands of poverty-stricken people. Haussmann bought up the land, moved the slum dwellers to the outskirts, and then turned his attention to the constant gridlock that plagued the city streets. With the arrival of new railways into Paris, his vision was to link all the main stations with wide boulevards so that traffic would flow more smoothly.
There was absolutely no link between any of these railway stations and the others. And this meant that going from one region of France to another region of France with the obligation to go through Paris meant an enormous effort and enormous difficulties just to come across Paris.
This boulevard was built to link two of the main stations in the north of Paris to the city center. Wide and fast, it wasn't just an expressway. There was also space for large sidewalks and trees. With this as his blueprint, Haussmann carved more large boulevards running up and down and across the city. He built more roads radiating from the Arc de Triomphe. And he widened the Champs-Élysées. By easing traffic congestion, Haussmann believed that both Paris and the economy would grow. Paris became a giant construction site. Slums were torn down and replaced by apartment buildings that conformed to Haussmann's specifications. With their tidy ground floor shops and orderly balconies, his buildings were exactly 66 feet in height. But Haussmann's grand design had a secret agenda. His wide, straight boulevards owed as much to military strategy as they did to urban planning. Haussmann wanted to make it easy for soldiers to prevent rioting. In the middle of this square in the east end of Paris, Haussmann placed a cavalry regiment. Mounted soldiers stationed in these barracks controlled this side of Paris, where riots and revolution had usually started. But the troops needed a clear line of sight down this boulevard to communicate with their infantry comrades stationed 3 miles to the southeast. The problem was that this boulevard would have to cross a canal that brought water and freight into Paris. A bridge over the canal would have blocked the soldiers' view and made it easier for rioters to erect barricades and isolate this part of Paris. Haussmann astonished his engineers with a radical and costly solution. He ordered them to dig the canal underground for over a mile to avoid any need for a bridge, an extraordinary feat of engineering that took 2 years to complete. Running shipping through an underground canal in the center of Paris in complete darkness was unthinkable, especially since there was no electricity at the time. The engineers came up with an ingenious solution to provide both light and air.
In this tunnel, apart from the few illuminated signs that you can see in front, there's no electricity, no electric lighting. All the navigational lighting comes from skylights, which are cut into the roof. You can see one of them. It's just up here.
These skylights allowed daylight and fresh air to flood in. Like a series of beacons or landing lights, they guided the barges safely through the canal. Haussmann's ingenuity meant that Parisian barges could keep their shortcut to the river Seine in the city center, and the military could keep their clear line of sight to prevent riots. In less than 30 years, Haussmann dramatically redrew the map of Paris. His boulevards linked every part of the city. He expanded the city's boundaries into new communities to encourage more people to live in Paris. And he built parks, which marked the first time that Parisians had communal areas simply for relaxation. Haussmann reshaped Paris, but he is not responsible for the city's single greatest landmark. That distinction falls to engineer Gustave Eiffel. Built in 1889, the Eiffel Tower truly symbolizes Paris. This unique film, taken in 1900, shows the first images of the finished Eiffel Tower. It is some of the earliest movie footage ever shot. Completed in just 2 years, the Eiffel Tower was a product of the rapid progress of engineering. It was constructed out of steel girders bolted together into what was then the tallest building in the world. It launched Paris onto the world stage. In drawing up his grand plan for Paris, Haussmann expected the city's population to reach a maximum of 3 million. Little did he know that in modern times, war and invasion would threaten the growth of Paris again. In 1940, Paris was invaded by Germany. Hitler's Nazi troops marched down Haussmann's wide, straight boulevard straight into the heart of Paris. During their 4-year occupation, the Germans left the buildings largely untouched. But when they withdrew in 1944, Hitler ordered that Paris be destroyed. The commander of the city refused to obey. When American troops liberated Paris, they found it just as Haussmann had designed it. After the war, Paris grew into a desirable and chic capital city. Below ground, metro and high-speed commuter trains link the capital with its suburbs. Above ground, the city looks almost frozen in time, its streets and buildings a glorious reminder of the work of Eugene Haussmann. Until this. A 40-story skyscraper called the Tour Montparnasse was built in the heart of one of Paris's oldest districts in 1972.
At the time it was built, everyone hated it. Probably because it's not a very good architecture, and certainly because it's not in the right place. And the problem is that because of this tower, it became absolutely forbidden to build another tower in France.
The Parisians' dislike of a single building brought the skyscraper dream to a dramatic end. But even if the rules changed and Parisian planners want to build upwards again, they'd find it difficult. Underneath the city are thousands of old quarries that supplied limestone for the buildings of Paris. Underground Paris has been likened to a block of Swiss cheese, so full of tunnels that the bedrock is too fragile to withstand the foundations needed for skyscrapers. So all of Paris's tall buildings are outside the city in an area called La Défense. It's an exclusive sanctuary reserved for modern architecture.
In La Défense, Paris built everything he didn't want to see in the center. Very few dwellings and a lot of offices and commercial centers.
Since the Second World War, successive French presidents have left their mark on Paris. Some building choices have been controversial. With its elevators and air conditioning on the outside, the Pompidou Center is still the most talked about and visited building in Paris, even 30 years after it opened. So is the glass pyramid in the courtyard of the very regal Louvre Museum. Paris is built and sustained by feats of engineering that are hidden from view. It's engineering that has helped to transform a wild, seemingly uninhabitable site into one of the world's most glamorous cities. It's engineering that has helped build walls for protection, trapped and filtered vital drinking water, bridged the mighty river Seine, and conquered disease. Paris, renowned for its elegance and beauty, is kept alive by ingenious engineering.
Did you know? Notre Dame Cathedral is at the very heart of Paris, literally. All road distances to and from the city of Paris are measured from a single spot called the Kilomètre Zero, a point on the pavement by the west entrance of the note entrance of the note entrance of the note entrance of the note entrance of the